Welcome back to Bay Area Focus. We have an amazing guest sitting down at our table today. Major Miguel Reece understands better than anyone the price of freedom after serving for over 30 years in the U.S. Air Force. But what happens when members of our military come home? It's an important question that Major Reece covers in his book, The Disabled Veteran's Story. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. And again, thank you for your service to this country.
Well, thank you. Can I add a little part to that?
Sure.
We talk about thank you for your service. We should include the sacrifices as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. Because we sacrifice, our parents sacrifice, the kids sacrifices, the grandparents sacrifice, and today the caretakers are sacrificing.
And that's what you talk about in the book. It's not just the person who enlisted, it's the family around them too who sacrificed.
The holistic journey, yes ma'am.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about your background first in the Air Force, your journey.
Well, my journey was I was drafted and I skipped state and I enlisted in the Air Force. And then someone decided I ought to become an officer after 12 years. And I became a hospital administrator and who lived about in 29 countries and enjoy making a difference.
Mm-hmm. And you served in the Vietnam War.
Yes, ma'am.
You're a Vietnam vet.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell me about what that experience was like coming back home from the Vietnam War, because it was a much different experience than what I think military people deal with today.
It was pretty sad. Most of us who came back from Vietnam either became alcoholics or drug addicts because we were so ashamed of what we had done and where we had been and the way society acknowledged us and accepted us, which they didn't. You know, some of us, we got spat on and called baby killers, and we just didn't say anything. I came back in 1971, and I never talked about it till 1986. It was the first time I ever mentioned to anyone that I had served in Vietnam. Mm. And so it was sad. It is sad, just the thought of it.
The thought of it, especially because of all of the sacrifice that you and many others did, and to come home and not be welcomed.
Right.
That just seems out there. You know, you talked about a lot of veterans that become alcoholics, and there's a big percentage of the homeless population that are veterans.
Yes, there are. I think there are about 20%. I mean, today there's about 8 million people who are affected with what they call post-traumatic stress disorder. These are the guys that are sitting, some of the guys are sitting on street corners, hearing voices, seeing things that no one else sees, and even smelling things that no one else smells. And they're talking to themselves, to those voices. And some of them commit suicide. About 22 a day commit suicide because of those voices and the shame or whatever drives them to do it.
So what compelled you to write this book?
Well, after I retired, after my 30 years and 42 days in the military, I went on to work for the VA, and I was an investigator, field examiner, and the veterans and their families asked me to tell their story. They said, you have to tell my story. So I went on and wrote the book. It took me 2 years to write the book because I wanted the reader to be a part of the journey. I mean, when you talk about the sacrifices a mother makes, you talk about the sacrifices a spouse makes, talk about the sacrifices a child makes. And today, the caretakers, you know, it's hard. It really is. And the book speaks about it. The book speaks about how some people even abuse the vets. Because, you know, it's, you know, churches, attorneys, and those are some of the stories in the book.
Yeah, when you talk about how much of an impact the service makes on families, you talked about children a little bit, and you know the kids, they enroll in a school and they may not have those, they may not be at that school a year from now if their mother or father has to move.
Well, one of the stories I wrote about is a girl that talked about transferring 10 different times, changing schools 10 different times, and how it affected her. She felt as if she didn't trust anyone. Today, she really don't have a friend because she don't trust people. She don't trust herself. Because back in those days, they called it peer pressure. Today, they call it bullying, and how she was affected with the bullying. And the mom who had to start over and over every time she went 9 different places, and every time she had to start from the bottom up. So she never got to that point. Matter of fact, I had a book signing at Fort Hood and this lady came. Her husband was retiring after 26 years, and she talked about how glorious it was, all the things he had done at her sacrifice. And she broke down during a retirement because one of the situation was while he was deployed, their 13-year-old daughter got pregnant. Said it was all her fault, and she blamed herself. But this was one of the best times that he had served, and they glorified it. So she just broke down. So that's the trauma that goes through it. And,
yeah, sure. It's very traumatic. And you went and talked to so many people. How did you decide which stories to put in the book?
Well, that's kind of interesting because depending on how much, like the first story talked about the guy who spent 3 years and 3 years and 7 months as a prisoner of war. He had a journal, and he wanted me. He insisted that I tell his story. He said, "You have to tell my story about those 3 years," because when he came back, the lady he was engaged to, she had married to someone else, and then the kids, they talked about how tough it was. You know, and then he didn't want any benefits. He felt as though he came back with the best price in life, the best benefit, and that was life. He had all his body parts and so forth, so on. So, and then the other story, the guy said, "I didn't want you, don't show up at my house." And then I showed up at the house, and he says, "You don't look like a Miguel." So they called back to the office and said, "We got this colored fella at the house." He said his name is Miguel, but he doesn't look like a Miguel. So the question was, what does a Miguel look like?
Right.
And but then at the end of that conversation, which is real interesting, because on my way here, this lady wanted a book, and she read that story, and she started crying because it applied to her, because she had a daughter who was mentally challenged. And one of the things the VA allow you to do, if the condition existed prior to the 13th birthday, they're entitled to benefits. So now she realized that her daughter will be taken care of for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
So, so the book really, how did I come up with this I don't know. It's just, and interestingly, every story applies to someone.
Yeah. Well,
like in your case, your husband traveled.
Yeah, it does.
He travels around. And
anyone can relate to some of the stories that you've put in this book, and we thank you so much for sharing all of these stories and for coming on and sharing your story as well. Thank you so much. And you can find out more about Miguel Reece and his book, The Disabled Veteran Story, at miguelreece.com. Stay with us because we have more Bay Area Focus coming up after the break.